Today on our Ending Parkinson's Disease webcast, we're going to examine environmental factors that contribute to Parkinson's disease to figure out, who's been exposed to it and how we can prevent these risk factors from contributing to the increasing rise of Parkinson's disease. Today, we're going to focus on a chemical called trichloroethylene, or TCE. If you're like me, you've never really heard about trichloroethylene or TCE. I didn't hear about it until about 2 years ago when I started writing this book with my colleagues. However, 8% of workers have worked with this chemical. So 8% of people have worked with this chemical. Some of us had it enter our homes or workplaces undetected, and all of us have been exposed to us. For some of our listeners, it may be the cause or likely the cause for your Parkinson's disease. To help us understand TCE and its link to Parkinson's disease, we have two wonderful guests. The first is Dan Kinel. Dan is a partner in law specializing in securities law at the law firm Harder, Seacrest & Emery in Rochester, New York. Dan developed Parkinson's in his 40s and has been a fierce advocate for the condition ever since. He and his firm have hosted numerous Parkinson's disease events, including many with the Michael J. Fox Foundation. He's participated in countless research studies, and he's constantly working to raise awareness of the disease. Dan completed his undergraduate studies at Brandeis University and law school at the American University, both with honors. Dan, many thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our second guest is Dr. Briana De Miranda. Briana is a neurotoxicologist. There are actually neurotoxicologists out there, and we have one for you today. She's completing her postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Pittsburgh with Dr. Timothy Greenemeyer. That lab has identified numerous environmental risk factors for Parkinson's disease. And actually, Todd Scher, the CEO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation and the co-author of the book, came from that exact same lab. So she's coming from a great place. Briana completed her bachelor's in biological sciences and doctorate in toxicology at Colorado State University, and will soon be a faculty member at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. She's quickly emerging as one of the country's leading authorities on TCE and Parkinson's disease. Briana, thanks very much for taking time.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Dan today.
So Briana, we'll start with an easy question. What is trichloroethylene, or TCE?
Yeah, so that is a good, easy question because TCE is an incredibly common compound. It's what's called a chlorinated organic solvent, which is really just a fancy word for a degreasing compound. TCE has been used throughout the US and the world as an industrial solvent or degreaser since about the 1920s or 30s. And it's been predominantly used in the manufacturing industry, but also the dry cleaning industry, and even at one point as a surgical anesthetic. We can still find it today in some of these places, including manufacturing, and as well as some household products that you might use to remove grease or oil.
So it's also been used to decaffeinate coffee, was used in whiteout. It's used in a wide range of occupations. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those occupations?
Yeah, so some of the occupations that would have been using TCE in their everyday use is things like manufacturing. So think of heavy manufacturing where you'd be making metal parts or potentially electrical components. So the early semiconductor industry used a lot of TCE in producing electrical parts for computers. It's used predominantly now in the refrigerant industry, so it's actually used as a chemical feedstock to produce a refrigerant, and that's its predominant use today. It's used as a vapor degreaser or a cold degreaser, so those are two different ways that individuals might use this at their workplaces. It was also used for a long time in the US military as a general solvent and also as a chemical feedstock. It was actually even used at one point in animal feed processing way back in the 1900s. So it's really been used in pretty much everywhere you could imagine where you need to take grease or dust or oil off of a metal part.
I've even heard people use it to prepare bodies for burial.
Yeah, it's sort of a wonder solvent in that way. It's almost, if you can imagine it, it's been used. And of course, many of these applications have been scaled back in modern times, but really it's been until the late 80s, early to mid 90s, it was still ubiquitously pretty much used in most industries throughout the United States.
We're always looking for stories. If you have stories, if you've been worked in one of these previous occupations or have stories about people who have been, please let us know either in the chat function or in the Q&A. In addition to people who work with the chemical, people get exposed to it in a wide variety of ways. So just because you didn't work in one of these occupations listed here, there are other ways that people get exposed to it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so if you are an individual who lives near a location that TCE is heavily used on site, so for example, many of the people who live near a site of heavy industry would be exposed to TCE potentially through their air or through groundwater. It's released into the environment, predominantly into the air, but it can also make its way into groundwater and soil. And so our major source of environmental exposure to TCE is either through inhalation, and you don't necessarily have to be outside to inhale it. It's actually a common indoor pollutant as well, or through drinking it in water. And one of the reasons why TCE is particularly tricky is because it does have this volatile component to the chemical. So even though it's predominantly in a liquid form, it will actually travel through groundwater in these kind of aqueous plumes, and it can vaporize and rise up through the floors and through the soil and actually pose a vapor intrusion hazard into homes or buildings. And so that's one way that we might have inhalational exposure occur even to individuals who do not work directly with the compound.
You want to just walk people through and show them the chemical structure of trichloroethylene? It's just 2 carbons, 3 chlorines, and a hydrogen atom, and then how this gets into people's groundwater and into their homes.
Yeah, so very small chemical, so it's readily dispersed in the air. And what I have drawn at the top there is the chemical being released through directly through vapor to air. And then that's obviously one way that you would be exposed is simply by breathing it in through contaminated air. Next, if the compound makes its way through the soil, it can actually reach certain water aquifers depending on their depth underneath the soil. And then TCE travels in what we consider sort of a toxic plume through that groundwater, and it'll eventually make its way under homes and businesses. And then what we have showing you in the second part of that figure is the TCE could either come up through the water directly into the house, so you might be exposed by drinking water, or it can vaporize and then intrude into the airspace within the house, and that would be your major pathways for exposure.
Thanks very much, Briana. Dan, thank you first of all for all the efforts that you do on behalf of the Parkinson's community. Can you tell us a little bit about your Parkinson's journey?
Sure. Well, I was diagnosed at age 43 in 2013, about 7 years ago. And actually, in hindsight, I had symptoms going back well before that. I remember losing my sense of smell in 2007 or so. But yeah, actually didn't think it was that big a deal because my 1-year-old was in diapers, and I thought that was sort of a bonus. A couple years after that, I went to a neurologist who diagnosed me that the diagnosis was that possibly was a result of statins I was taking. A couple years later, I had a sort of numbness in my right arm, and I was diagnosed with a potential pinched ulnar nerve. Fast forward a couple more years to 2013, right before my official diagnosis, and I felt a little bit of a tremor. And I thought, that's not right. And then I noticed it was not just a tremor, but the whole right side of my body wasn't responding like the left side of my body. I thought that's really not right. And I went to see my primary care physician, who said, Dan, you should really be a little concerned about this. You should see a neurologist. And I went to go talk to a neurologist at the University of Rochester. I was diagnosed in July of 2013.
What were your thoughts when you were diagnosed?
Well, it put me into a pretty deep, dark depression. I was 43, the height of my career. And I thought, my life was over. I was given a pamphlet with a real picture of an old man in a wheelchair, told how to do chair exercises. And I thought, I literally, thought that, I was going to be in a nursing home in 2 years. It took me several months to get out of that place. And quite frankly, you mentioned sort of being involved in the community. That's actually what brought me out of it. I decided I can either suffer with this in silence and depression, or I could do something about it. I chose the path of doing something about it. And so I got involved in research and advocacy and in the community.
And no one in your family has Parkinson's, is that correct?
In my immediate family, no.
And then when did you first hear of TCE?
I actually didn't hear of it until I read an early copy of your book. I thought to myself, that seems like a little ubiquitous in terms of its application everywhere. And I thought to myself, where could I have been exposed to TCE? And I'm a lawyer. I work in an office building. I never worked with a degreaser or in or on chemicals. I'm not a chemically oriented person. And then I in conversations with you and others, that sort of all of a sudden clicked that I probably have been exposed to it, and in sort of an unusual way.
We're going to get back to your story in a second. Briana, what's the role of TCE in Parkinson's disease?
So based on our knowledge from epidemiology studies, as well as laboratory research, including my own, it appears that TCE might increase risk for Parkinson's disease by causing toxicity to the neurons that degenerate in the disease, the dopamine neurons of the substantia nigra. And because TCE readily crosses the blood-brain barrier and it's known to produce neurological effects, in fact, one of the major neurological effects for individuals breathing in TCE is CNS depression. So people become tired or dizzy when they're exposed to TCE. So we know it's reaching the brain at pretty high quantities when people are exposed. And so we think that TCE represents a risk concern for Parkinson's disease.
So there was a major research study, two big research studies, one by Dr. Don Gash and his colleagues at Kentucky, at the University of Kentucky, who identified a cluster of people developing Parkinson's disease who worked directly with TCE. And then a second one, a twin study. You want to first discuss Dr. Gash's study?
Yeah, so this is a really fascinating study because this was a Parkinson's disease cluster, which are pretty rare for Parkinson's disease. It's not common that you find individuals either living or working in one location that all develop Parkinson's disease, especially if they have no family history. And that's what happened here. So there were 3 individuals who developed Parkinson's disease seemingly in relation to this open container of TCE within a factory where they would dip metal parts in, and at times up to their elbows without protective equipment on. And I think what's actually most remarkable about this study is that when these researchers began to investigate this, they went back and they actually examined other workers who had not been diagnosed with Parkinson's from this factory. And they actually found 27 individuals who worked within that factory pretty close in relation to these 3 people who were diagnosed with Parkinson's. And they actually found when they went and tested them that they had symptoms of motor dysfunction, including slower fine hand movements. And I think what's really important about that is it shows that we might be underdiagnosing Parkinson's disease from solvent exposures. So waiting for people to actually develop PD, you might get a few people who actually went on to develop Parkinson's disease symptoms, but clearly more individuals in that factory were actually affected by the neurological effects of TCE.
And then Hugh Johnson is asking, what's the hazard ratio, what's the relative risk associated with triethylene? Dr. Carly Tanner and colleagues answered that question in a twin study.
The twin study that Dr. Goldman and Dr. Tanner showed that for PD discordant twins, they predicted an increased odds ratio for individuals who worked with TCE to be 6.1. So they were 6 times more likely to develop Parkinson's disease if they worked with TCE.
6 times. So that's not like a small amount. It's not like 20%. That's not 30%. That's 500%.
Pretty significant. And it's important to note that it's a relatively small number, but that's supported by other research indicating that obviously we have other risks, including mechanisms that would suggest that TCE was directly responsible for those Parkinson's disease cases.
And I'll just read a brief excerpt from the book on this. And yet from 1981 to 1991, the production of TCE increased 1,000-fold, 1,000-fold increase in production of TCE from 1981 to 1991. It was nearly ubiquitous in American industry in the second half of the 20th century. a National Institutes of Health funded epidemiological study that linked work exposure to TCE to Parkinson's conclude that the potential public health implications are substantial. While U.S. production has decreased from its peak, millions of pounds of TCE continue to be released into the environment annually. It can be found in the air, the soil, food, and even human breast milk. Dan, you've been involved in looking at a cluster of individuals with Parkinson's disease. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, in the context of some of the volunteer work that I've done with you, Ray, it occurred to me that that out of a total of 79 or 80 people that I put in a category of people that I work with, I know of at least 4 who have developed Parkinson's, 4 for sure. And I thought to myself that that seems like a little high given the prevalence of Parkinson's in the overall community and in the overall population. What could be the potential cause of that? I thought back to where I work, where I live, what I've done in my life. And then I learned subsequent to that next to literally within feet of a parking garage, an underground parking garage that I parked my car in for several years, was a known plume of TCE that was a result of a dry cleaner that used to be on the site. I thought to myself, well, that's a potential cause. And so we're looking into whether that actually could have contributed to the onset of my PD.
So these underground plumes, as Briana indicated, occur when people improperly dispose of TCE, often by just pouring it directly in the ground. It goes into the soil, contaminates groundwaters, migrates sometimes for large distances, and then TCE, like radon, can evaporate from groundwater and soil and enter people's homes, schools, or places of work undetected.
So in my case, I thought the hypothesis is potentially that this doesn't migrate that long a distance. We're talking maybe a couple dozen feet, maybe a couple dozen yards at most. Is that I parked my car in a parking garage underground, adjacent to this TCE plume for 6 days a week for years, and that while my car was parked, the TCEs would sort of marinate my car in all kinds of toxic fumes. I'd finish working, close the door behind me, and get in my car and drive away and breathe this stuff in as I commuted back and forth to work and as I walked from the parking garage to my office. And this went on for 7 or 8 years, and everybody in this potential cluster experienced the same thing.
What are your next steps in evaluating this cluster?
So I think the next steps are going to be to submit a questionnaire to everybody who's in the cluster and ask them what their work history was, where they parked, where they worked. If we don't answer a lot of those questions, we need to have it confirmed. And then what their symptoms potentially of maybe, whether they're suffering any neurological issues at all. And then after that, we're going to collect the data and see if that cluster is a total of 4 or more than 4. For the sake of my coworkers, I hope it's 4. For the sake of building knowledge, if it's more than 4, I'd like to get to the bottom of it and not identify. Having a cause doesn't necessarily do anything for me. I mean, it doesn't fix my Parkinson's, doesn't make it go away, but hopefully can be something that spurs the community, the broader community, to action, so that that people don't have this. This is entirely preventable. There's nothing about exposure to TC that we can't prevent, future generations from suffering from Parkinson's. And if I can play a role in helping that happen and protecting my children and people I know around me from getting this disease, that would be a win for me.
Beyond your experience, you've also encountered friends and colleagues with Parkinson's who may have been exposed to TCE in other capacities. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So it's sort of having read the book and having had other people read the book. It's almost a universal experience for me. I talk to friends about what TCEs are, how they affect the possibility of the onset of PD. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. And I was talking to one friend. Literally, we're sitting in my house chatting about the book and what TCEs were, and sort of a light of realization went on when I started going on his face. He said, Dan, I used to clean my family's kitchen equipment that we're using in our commercial restaurant for years by literally dipping the grill grates into TCEs. And he recounted to me how his wife used to yell at him, telling him, "You're going to get sick from that smell, from breathing that stuff in." And he'd say, "No, don't worry about it. It's been around forever. Nobody's gotten sick from it." And I felt the chill on my spine because we both realized at the same time this is likely the cause of his PD. Another example would be a friend of mine who went for a jog every day. He thought he was keeping himself in good shape, thought he was exercising, doing the right thing. going for a run, taking care of his body. Well, it turns out he was running right over a known contaminated site of TCEs on a daily basis. And he developed PD at age 42, I think. And then just, until people know that this is a problem, they don't think about their history, what they've done, and how they've actually been exposed to it, and how it may have impacted them. But it's shocking how many people I talk to have identified, and almost immediately after I talk about this issue with them, they identify potential cause of exposure for themselves.
So in the book, we highlight a story very similar to you in opening the chapter 5 on cleaning up how solvents and contaminated groundwater spread the disease. We tell the story of Danny Fromm, who was a typical Southern California teenager. Straight out of high school, he began working in the aerospace industry, cleaning circuit boards with the solvent TCE. Never warned of any risk or provided with protective gear, he inhaled the sweet-smelling chemical and exposed his skin to it for 8 hours a day over the course of a decade. When Fromm was 35, he noticed that his right pinky kept twitching. Stress, his first doctor said, and recommended a little wine. His second doctor gave him a much different diagnosis, Parkinson's disease. Danny Fromm, who we thank for contributing his story to the book, later started levodopa, developed some complications, had deep brain stimulation. Danny Fromm, later in the book, regrets every day that he stayed at his aerospace job working with trichloroethylene, sometimes called tri or trike. While the solvent has not been proven definitively to cause Parkinson's, those who are exposed to it at work are 6 times more likely to develop the disease than those who are not. If you're working with it, Fromm says, quit your damn job and get away from it. Briana, can we get away from TCE?
Not very easily at present. We can control some of our exposure. In fact, if your exposure is high, you can control a lot of that exposure. There are remediation efforts that we can take as individuals to actually reduce either air or water concentrations of TCE that we are exposed to in our own homes. So for example, you can ventilate and purify the air in your home if it's found to be very high in TCE concentration. You can use types of carbon filters to filter water. Most people, I think, do filter their water that they drink. However, what we worry about with TCE is actually not necessarily the water that you're drinking, but rather the water that's entering your home in general. And most of us don't filter the water that we use to cook with or to bathe with. And those are 2 sources, particularly when you heat the water, of exposure to TCE. So it vaporizes and then you breathe it in. So warm water is a big source of TCE exposure. If you do find that your home or the area that you live in is very high, there are resources available for individuals. They can at times be costly, and they could, cause major construction to have to occur, but it can be remediated from the individual home. As far as cleanup efforts that would require government intervention, those would be obviously more difficult, given that the EPA already has a ton of contaminants, including TCE, that it's working on remediating through several sites, and the cleanup efforts are sometimes not complete. And just like any contaminant in the United States, it's quite persistent.
Dan mentioned, yeah, sure.
Okay, can I jump in with another example of TCE that this occurred to us within the last couple of weeks? So we bought my son, my teenage son, a bed from a local furniture store. We unpacked it, set up in his room, and as we were setting it up, my son noticed that the pieces of metal had a slight coating on it that was sweet smelling, and we put it in his room, and the whole room smelled like solvents. I can't smell it because I have no sense of smell, but it immediately occurred to me that this bed is the metal components of this bed were likely wiped clean with TCE containing materials because of the sweet smell and the light coating, and it's now sitting in our garage waiting to be thrown away, basically, because we could have inadvertently set this bed up and basked him in TCEs that were used to clean the metal pieces of this put together bed unknowingly. So it shows up in odd places.
Concerning to say the least. Briana, there are lots of contaminated sites throughout the country. It's not just in Rochester, New York. It's throughout the country. There's at least 21 contaminated Superfund sites in Silicon Valley that are contaminated with trichloroethylene. Can you tell us a little bit about what these sites are and how common they are?
Yeah, so throughout the United States, we have a number of sites that have been designated as either Superfund sites, which are sites that contain any environmental contamination. And we have actually over 40,000 Superfund sites in the United States. However, about 1,600 of those are on the national priorities list, which means that they're the most heavily contaminated and they need to undergo remediation. As far as where TCE is contaminated with that, throughout those Superfund sites, it's in the majority of them. And so sometimes it's in higher quantities than in others. But the US EPA is aware of where TCE is located in these sites, and in the sites that are currently being remediated, it's undergoing different steps to try and remove that. I think that it's a good time to mention that TCE is not the only halogenated solvent that might be within these sites. So there's structurally similar compounds to TCE. An example would be perchloroethylene, which is the most commonly used solvent in the dry cleaning industry. And so there are hundreds of structurally similar compounds to TCE that are also in these Superfund sites throughout the United States. So I think that it's a problem in the sense that it's bigger than what we can do on an individual scale, and it involves policy and government remediation.
Great. Can you see the map, Briana?
Yes.
So this is the map of Superfund sites throughout the United States contaminated with TCE. And so you can see if you live near one, I mentioned that there's 21 in Silicon Valley as alone. And in addition to these Superfund sites, there are thousands of others in virtually every state in the country that are contaminated with trichloroethylene. Michigan has a large number, for example. So even if you don't live near one of the Superfund sites, there are lots of other sites that have been contaminated with TCE. Again, can cause problems with indoor air or contaminates up to 30% of groundwater in the US. Right. So there's some good news here. One is that TCE can be remediated. Do you want to say a word about that? And then maybe we'll talk about potential treatments.
Yeah, so I think it is a compound that can be remediated. You know, we've heard a lot, some people might be familiar with this term forever chemicals. TCE is a compound that is very slow to degrade. And so it kind of depends on where it is in the environment. If it's in the air, it degrades faster than if it's in the water. And, you know, it's, of course, in science, we always say it depends. And so it sort of depends on how much TCE there is in a given site and where it's located. Is it in the soil? How deep is it in the soil? That sort of thing. But ultimately, it can be remediated. It just takes a significant amount of effort. If you are concerned about whether you live close to a site where TCE either has been released or is currently being released, you can look that up on the US EPA website. They have what's called a Toxics Release Inventory, or TRI program, and you can actually look down to the zip code of where TCE is being released. And so if you are not already aware of an environmental concern where you live, you can check that through the US EPA website. And that might drive whether you want to take further steps in getting your air or water monitored for TCE and structurally similar solvents.
So in the book, we have a prescription for action. These gray colored pages at the end of the book are your prescription for action. And we're talking about banning TCE in a second, but if you're worried about your water being contaminated with TCE, we give you the phone number for the Safe Drinking Water Hotline, 800-426-4791. And if you're worried about living near one of these contaminated sites, or your kids go to a school near one of these contaminated sites, we give you information to learn about both vapor intrusion, how the chemical comes in, invades homes and workplaces and schools, and how to find out if you live near a Superfund site. There's some hope with some of the treatments. There's a class of drugs that target a gene that's implicated in Parkinson's disease called LRRK2. You've done some research suggesting that independent of having a genetic mutation, TCE might have some influence on this gene. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. So what my research has focused on in the last couple of years has really been trying to understand what we call gene-environment interaction. And we're focused on specific types of toxicants that we might be exposed to commonly and underlying genetic risk factors that would combine to cause elevated risk for Parkinson's disease. And the gene that's most commonly mutated in inherited form of Parkinson's is called LRRK2, and it's a kinase protein that becomes overactivated. What we've actually found through our research is that environmental toxicants, and these include pesticides such as rotenone or paraquat, but also TCE, actually cause an elevation in LRRK2 kinase activity that is similar to the elevation that we see in these inherited mutations. And so because of this, it indicates a couple of things. The first is that we are showing a physiology through environmental exposure that matches Parkinson's disease pathology. The second is that individuals who already have mutations in these genes might be even more increased risk to developing Parkinson's disease if they are exposed to these environmental toxicants, again, including TCE. But then on the flip side, and I think one of the most exciting things is that we are currently using LRRK2 kinase inhibitors. These are small molecule inhibitors to actually reduce the pathology that was induced by these environmental toxicants, including pesticides and TCE. And so as LRRK2 and kinase inhibitors are in clinical trials right now to try and help individuals with Parkinson's disease to actually stop the progression of the disease, we are hopeful that our research would point to potentially more people would be benefited by these LRRK2 kinase inhibitors than just individuals with the genetic mutation.
So both TCE and genetic mutations can lead a protein called LRRK2 to become inappropriately overactive. Pharmaceutical companies, including Denali Therapeutics, are developing drugs that would turn down this LRRK2 protein, and those studies are ongoing.
That's exactly right.
Dan, other thoughts or comments before we go to the questions?
I guess my only comment is that I'm sure we're going to get more into this, but that this is something that's entirely preventable. You know, that we don't use asbestos anymore because asbestos is not good for your lungs. It causes mesothelioma. You know, it's relatively straightforward. No, there's no real debate over that. You know, there should be no debate over whether we should use these chemicals in any way, shape, or form. If it causes Parkinson's, I mean, the societal impact, the personal impact, the family impact are just so great that there's no reason we should not find substitutions for these chemicals, decrease our equipment in another way, find another way to do this. It's just not worth it.
And so TCE is not new. It's been around since the 1920s, and as we highlight in the book, its toxic effects have been known since at least 1932. First question from Mr. Mark Alexander. I'm going to summarize a little bit. He points out that some of the early symptoms of Parkinson's disease are loss of smell, as Dan, you pointed out, and constipation. This leads me to think that there might be an oral route as well as an olfactory route for Parkinson's disease. I wonder if anyone can say the phenotype of these two groups, and does one tend to be more tremor predominant or medication resistant, or are there differences in autopsy studies? Briana, you want to start?
As far as phenotype that results from, you know, how the disease originates, that's very difficult for us to assess right now. You know, Parkinson's disease is really an umbrella term for a number of degenerative conditions that can, you know, include a motor component. And so I think what's very important to remember is, like what this question is stating, is that phenotype can vary widely between individual. And so we have to treat the disease that way. You know, we can't always do a one size fits all treatment. You know, as far as GI symptoms being in the prodromal portion of PD, that certainly appears to be the case. So, you know, in terms of environmental exposure, we do think that there are potential ways that exposure to, you know, you could be ingesting something with one of these toxins in it, whether that's a pesticide, whether that's a solvent, that could potentially affect the GI system, the gut microbiome, and that could be a potential source for disease, either initiation or potentially progression. you might have more to add on that.
So it is a little interesting and a little concerning that many of the known environmental risk factors for Parkinson's disease, TCE, and pesticides both enter in through the nose and the gut. And the earliest symptoms of Parkinson's disease aren't tremor, but really loss of smell and constipation, which happens decades before tremor and slowness of movement develop. Dan, did you want to chime in?
That's consistent with my own experience. I lost my sense of smell. I knew I lost my sense of smell at least 7 or 8 years before I developed the tremor. And that's consistent with my conversations with other patients as well. It's oftentimes the case where the early symptoms are the loss of smell, the constipation, things that aren't connected to Parkinson's until years later, until after the formal diagnosis is made.
Renee McNiff asks, are there major areas of the country that have been designated as heavy TCE places, Briana?
Well, I think your map showed really nicely the Superfund sites that contain TCE, and that is, in general, where we see TCE used heavily. So major sites of industry, so for example, the Eastern Seaboard, the oil and gas region in the Gulf Coast, the West Coast in Silicon Valley in particular has a lot of TCE, and my home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania has a lot of heavy industry in it as well. So, these are all places where we might find more TCE than in more rural areas. And so really urban environments that, you might get a lot of houses clustered together over where these TCE plumes occur. Of course, the most significant site that we have data on is actually a Marine base in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. And so this Marine base was contaminated between the 1950s and the 1980s with trichloroethylene and tetrachloroethylene, and it remains today a site of an incredible amount of both of these chemicals.
There are some great documentaries on that, and that story is also told in the book. Speaking of Pittsburgh, Kate Quinlan from Vero Beach, Florida says, my husband grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, around the steel mills. Was TCE present in those? Also, a lot of people who are exposed to these chemicals, some get Parkinson's and some don't. Why?
So I think it's safe to say most steel mills probably have at least some amount of TCE in them. It really depends on the type of operation that the steel mills are using. So it's not a given that every single factory will be, ubiquitously using TCE, at least not at a level where people are, say, dipping metal parts into TCE or using vapor degreasing. But certainly, the steel industry and TCE, they are related. I don't think that Pittsburgh is currently a huge source from my research more recently of TCE. So I can say that, I've monitored my local environment pretty carefully, and Pittsburgh's done a really good job of reducing its use of TCE. Why do some people exposed get PD and others do not? This is a really complicated question, one that we are actively searching for the answer. We think it's certainly a combination of genetic and environment factors, as well as lifestyle factors, including diet and exercise. It can be a number of different things. It's incredibly complicated, but ultimately it probably depends on when you were exposed and how much you were exposed to, what underlying genetic risk factors you might have, as well as some of the other things we know, other genes that are involved in metabolizing TCE, whether or not you're a smoker. The list is pretty lengthy, but we don't really know is sort of the short answer, and we're hoping to find that out.
And so it's worth noting that numerous environmental risk factors linked with Parkinson's disease doesn't mean that you're exposed to that, you necessarily develop it, nor does it mean that you've been exposed to it and you didn't develop it, that they're not implicated. So for example, everyone knows that smoking causes lung cancer, but only 10% of smokers develop. There are clearly other important genetic factors and other environmental factors that determine who when exposed to these risk factors develops the disease or not. Dan Keller asks, has trichloroethylene been implicated only in Parkinson's disease, or does it affect other parts of the body, peripheral nerves, cardiac, muscle, and lung?
It's absolutely a compound that affects other areas of the body. TCE is implicated predominantly in cancer. It is classified as a group 1 carcinogen. So this is a classification by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, which classifies all compounds as potential carcinogens. And group 1 is pretty much the highest classification you can get. So it means
The worst.
Yes, it's a known carcinogen. And it's the carcinogenicity of TCE that has actually caused most countries to reduce its use. It's not the neurological effects that they were concerned about, it was cancer. And it's highly associated with kidney and liver cancer. Those are the 2 target organs of TCE. That's where it's metabolized. So a lot of people who worked with TCE, especially in really high concentrations, went on to develop kidney and liver cancer. It's also associated with some forms of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. We also worry about fetal development with TCE. So individuals who were exposed during gestation may have heart defects that were associated with even very low levels of TCE during that gestational time. So unfortunately, it gets into every piece of tissue in our body, and it can cause dysfunction in a lot of them.
If you want to learn more about this, at Camp Lejeune, there's even a cemetery that's filled with young kids, some fetuses and some newborns who were still born with substantial neural tube defects, and others. Lori Lou Freshwater describes a story about how 2 of her brothers died, likely from exposure to TCE, and she and her family grew up and Camp Lejeune, a Marine base in North Carolina. Again, a very disturbing story that we did discuss in the book. Dietrich Borschott, I hope I get that right. Great book, thank you. I worked in applied farming 30 years ago. PD was diagnosed 2 years ago. I wonder, how is it possible to prove a personal evidence for a link to chemicals like paraquat, or for that matter, TCE?
So that's a good question, and it's something that Ray and I have been working on, actually. We are interested in how we might be able to prove that Parkinson's disease was caused by an exposure. And of course, the answer is that it's very difficult. It's hard to assess what caused idiopathic Parkinson's disease, and partially because of the reasons that we listed a few minutes ago, in that it's a multifactorial disease. It takes a lot of things to cause Parkinson's. We don't know right now, beyond if we could actually measure paraquat or TCE in an individual's blood, or potentially in their CSF, if they've been exposed to that. So right now, it's really hard to do. We're currently searching if there's a way to understand that. Other than that, it would be just tracing of use of these chemicals. So looking at studies of individuals who've been exposed, and then looking at the history of the person who's been using that.
Dan, you're an attorney. You do a lot of work around evidence and proof. You have thoughts?
I think we just don't have the data yet. Hopefully, when some of these studies are completed, we'll have more data and we'll have more ability to make the direct linkage. But right now we can't. It's harder to do that right now. There's the legal basis. Just it's not as strong as it is for some other potential illnesses.
What kind of evidence would the law like to see?
I think that from a perspective of what we can do to make things change on a legal front, something that can't be, that somebody can't do an end run around. That it's definitive, that we can show that that the dose exposure to TCE created in X cases created a PD or other illness, and part of it is also that we just need more. We need more research. We need more than 1 or 2 studies. We need a whole host of studies, and the body of evidence needs to increase on the scientific end, and that will allow us to leverage things on the legal end, I hope.
We have some questions, including one from Melena Summerall around mitigation. Does a radon mitigation system also help mitigate TCE, or how can TCE be mitigated?
So I think it depends on how you're mitigating radon, but in general, the way TCE is mitigated through the air is if you have, if your house or business sits over a TCE source, so either the groundwater or the soil underneath your house, you can usually vent that. You would vent it from below your house to outside of your house or above it. So basically, you need to create an airflow pattern to where the TCE is not rising through your home. So that would be the way that we mitigate TCE within the home. And yeah, this is a picture of how a TCE system is basically allowing the airflow to go from below the house to outside of the house. And that's how we would mitigate TCE. So radon, I think, is typically shuttled from, you vent from inside the house to outside of the house. So I think they can differ. There are, certain air purifiers that can potentially help, although they would have to be pretty significant and industrial in order to actually take VOCs out of the air. So your average air purifier is not going to reduce TCE exposure in the home.
Joy Milne asks, is it true that anesthesiologists before closed circuit ventilation in theaters that they were being exposed to TCE? My husband was an anesthesiologist diagnosed at 44.
So that's, very possible. It's always hard to trace back exposures, right? So, we were talking about the law firm where, maybe it wasn't the actual floor that you worked on, but the garage in which the cars were sitting. It's hard to trace where the TCE is coming from. It's absolutely true that, TCE used to be used as an anesthesia. So it depends, obviously, on how that was being applied. We do worry about people who are working with it every day, especially in its vaporized form, because that could easily be inhaled. And so that would, potentially be a source of how you could be exposed through a profession that way.
And so as an anesthetic, was widely used often for pregnant women for labor as an anesthetic agent. It was banned in the 1970s, I think, by the FDA due to safety concerns. And so, you can think about the timing of the exposure, and that could help you determine whether it's likely or not. I think it's also worth noting, although that use of TCE has decreased in the US, it's still used. And that it was used very commonly in the 70s. So when people might have been getting exposure when they're at a young age and then developed Parkinson's disease decades later. Sarah Pisani thanks us for the webcast. I'd like to ask whether there's any evidence of a relationship between the genetic mutation or genetic vulnerabilities and the effects of TCE on the development of Parkinson's. This is your research, Briana.
Yeah, so I hope I answered a little bit of that when I was talking about the LRRK2 mutations. I would add on that to mention that, the vast majority of Parkinson's disease is idiopathic. We only have a very small amount of what we call inherited Parkinson's disease. And of those inherited Parkinson's disease, unless you have one of the very rare what we call autosomal recessive mutations that result predominantly in young onset Parkinson's disease, even a mutation in LRRK2 or some of the other common mutations like GBA, people don't always go on to develop Parkinson's. And for a long time, we really haven't understood why. I think from my research perspective, it would seem that environmental exposures would at least play a significant role in whether individuals with underlying risk factors go on to develop the disease. And so I think gene-environment interaction is absolutely, central to Parkinson's development.
I had one more question for you, Briana, then I'll go to Dan. How do I test my home air or water for TCE?
So some of the links that you have available and that you mentioned earlier through the website, the book's website, would be a resource to look for whether your water system, your municipal water system is positive for TCE. If you're on well water, those have to be monitored typically by the user. So you would probably need to have that monitored through either a municipal or private lab. The website that you can visit that will help you get more information on this is atsdr.cdc.gov. It's a CDC website that will tell you how to test air and water for TCE, and what to do if the concentrations are found to be too high.
Can you repeat that website a little bit more slowly? We'll post it in the chat so people can go there.
Definitely. It's atsdr.cdc.gov.
Great. And we'll work to put that on our website, endingpd.org. Dan, you already have Parkinson's disease. Brianna's mentioned some treatments that actually might help people like you if your Parkinson's is indeed due to TCE. Yet you're really passionate about trying to find out whether this TCE is a cause for potentially your Parkinson's and for those others. Why are you so passionate about it?
Because it's, I guess because I know PD sucks. It sucks to have. It's really, no, I don't wish it upon anybody. And if I can play a part in that, in helping others, preventing others from getting it, I would feel that I've been successful in some way in my volunteer endeavors. To be honest, point I think of the environmental factors as the genetic factors as sort of having a loaded gun, and then the environmental factors is pulling the trigger on it. If we can, even if you have the loaded gun, you don't have to. The trigger does not have to be pulled. That doesn't mean you have to eventually get PD. And if we can avoid that trigger from being pulled in as many people as possible, I think that we'll be successful in some way.
Briana, some European countries have banned trichloroethylene, have banned it for decades. United States hasn't. Why?
I think that we still have a lot of industry that occurs in the United States, and even though there are chemical alternatives to TCE, sometimes certain industries really rely on it. It's an excellent degreaser. Its reason for being so toxic is also why it's very good at what it does. So there is some pushback for why we need to ban it. Of course, it takes a lot of regulation and policy in order to ban a chemical. For TCE, we've seen periods of time where the EPA has put stricter regulations on it. One of those happened in 2007, which resulted in a significant reduction of TCE use in the military. The military really no longer uses TCE, and so that was a big source in the U.S. Prior to 2007. But in what strides we've made as a country to remediate it, there are still more efforts to be done to reduce its use. So that's something that I think we're interested in.
So the EPA has proposed banning TCE. Our first recommendation in our book for preventing Parkinson's disease is to ban paraquat, the pesticide linked to Parkinson's disease, and banning trichloroethylene. We give you the email address for the EPA administrator, Andrew Wheeler. So if you want to start a campaign and help us get rid of trichloroethylene, you can email him at wheeler.andrew@epa.gov, and we even give you his phone number. It's 202-564-4700. Again, it's right here on page 194 of the book. Dan and Briana, many thanks for joining us today, discussing some of the environmental contributors to Parkinson's disease. So first of all, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
There's other environmental risk factors, especially around pesticides, that we hope to investigate in an upcoming webinar. Many of you have also asked us how you can participate in research and other efforts tied to Parkinson's disease. So this Friday, April 24th, in just 2 days at 1 p.m. Eastern, we're hosting a webcast for individuals to learn about our Watch PD study. This study uses the Apple Watch to measure key features of Parkinson's disease, including tremor, movement, and other features. The study is open to individuals with early untreated Parkinson's disease, and all participants get an Apple Watch as a benefit of participating in the study. If you think the way that we measure Parkinson's disease by tapping your thumb and index finger big and fast is a little bit antiquated and a little bit subjective, you're right, and we need better measures of the disease. So join us in learning more about that study on Friday, and we will send you an email link to join us for that webinar if we haven't done so already. And then our next webinar in this Ending Parkinson's Disease series is next Wednesday, April 29th at 1 p.m. Eastern, when we bring back Dr. Bas Bloom, who you guys gave us overwhelmingly positive feedback on. So thank you very much. He'll be back to discuss nutrition and Parkinson's disease with some great guests. In the interim, please buy and read the book if you have not already. All the authors are donating their proceeds to efforts to end Parkinson's disease. We're going to use ours to work with Dan Kinel to investigate this cluster of Parkinson's disease in Rochester, and we're going to work with Briana to find out if we can get measurements related to exposure to TCE, so we can determine whether or not TCE is a major factor contributing to Parkinson's disease. In addition, if you've read the book, please review it on Amazon or Goodreads. All you have to do is go to the Amazon website and type in Ending Parkinson's Disease, click on ratings. It takes less than 2 minutes to fill out a review. Similar, if you want one of the authors to join you and your friends or support group for a virtual book club, just go to our website, endingpd.org, and click on Host a Virtual Book Club. We'd be happy to join you. We can all work to get the word out to end Parkinson's disease together. So review the book, email the EPA Administrator, Andrew Wheeler, End Parkinson's Disease. End it.